welcome to our lecture today.
It's my honor to take part in the series arranged by the Preparatory Office for the International Center for Interpretation and Presentation of the World Heritage Sites. I myself have learned a lot from the previous talks. My research into difficult heritage are focused in Asia Pacific. In this talk, I will discuss World Heritage interpretation and reconciliation. I will focus on how interpretation matters and varies, especially in cases resulting from trauma and conflicts, which is unfortunately a significant part of human history, but has not been carefully addressed until a rather recent time. The past few months in this year actually witnessed unprecedented activism of Black Lives Matter across borders. As a result, there are calls for art and heritage sectors to support decolonizing collections and the imperial narratives around objects in museum collection or at heritage sites. In particular, those that have supported or have been acquired by means of colonial aggressions or with the profits of the slave trade must be identified, reviewed, and reinterpreted if not necessarily taken down. In the UK and the US, there have been growing discussion over giving clear and explicit information to audiences on history of the object and its acquisition, and how it came into the possession of the museum, investigating the reasons and deeper context. In the region of Asia Pacific, however, we are yet to fully reflect on how we can do better to decolonize the relationship among the heritage sites, the institutions that manage these sites, and the communities associated with the sites in different ways. Interpretation is never easy. There is never just one authorized interpretation of heritage. Even the UNESCO Heritage Program has established its goals as an instrument for the sustainable development of all societies through dialogue and mutual understanding since 1972. There has never been easy agreement on interpretation of heritage. In academia, too, understanding of heritage varies depending upon one's disciplinary orientation. Ecologists focus on biodiversity, while architectural historians emphasize the notion of authenticity. Some sociologists saw the appreciation of heritage as symptoms of late modern society, while political scientists pay attention to the cultural nationalism behind domination. Interpretation can even diverge within the same community. For example, we can see these two materials both about the Hiroshima Island and how it is interpreted differently among Japanese experts. On the left, I am showing you the pamphlet available at the 39th UNESCO meeting in 2015. On the right, I'm showing you a documentation done by a Japanese architectural historian published in 1970. It highlights the concrete high-rise buildings that appear at Hiroshima Island as the earliest experiment of dense living in a rather compact built environment as early as the 1910s. And again, on the left, in the booklet used for the UNESCO nomination, quote, Hiroshima Coal Mining Island is an artificial reclaimed island, the site of Japan's first major undersea coal exploitation, pioneered by Mitsubishi, and host to one of the world's most extraordinary former mining communities, end of quote. Here, we can see how the focus is placed on the extraordinariness. On the right, the architectural historian introduced the building, number 18, focusing on the bridge at the front that will connect the residential complex with the harbor. And in there, numerous photos exhibit the difficult situation, living condition on the island. Here, I'm just quickly showing you two materials and how interpretation can even vary within the same community. With one represented the state and one represented the architectural history as a discipline. And it is notable that none of them highlight the exploitation of labor in general, nor the forced laboring of Korean workers before the war. So in this slide, how can World Heritage Sites contribute to the historical process of reconciliation? How can the conversation over reconciliation be taken into account in interpreting related World Heritage Sites? On the surface, heritage sites has become even more contested in line with the globalization of memories. In effect, many contested heritage were legacy of tragic events resulting from a much longer term of uneven history of globalization itself. In Dresden, Germany, the reconstruction of Frauenkirche more than half a century after the wartime bombing was seen as a symbol of reconciliation. The new Golden Cross of Peace atop the dome was crafted by English goldsmiths whose father had participated in the bombing as a pilot. It takes time and a lot of international conversation to arrive at this particular moment. In many cases, difficult process of communication is yet to unfold. The kind of conversation in need is beyond placing blames, but conversation that would enable greater accountability and mutual understanding in terms of how to move on and avoid repeating the violence in the context of ongoing uneven globalization. In terms of global accountability, other than international trials, public apology has become increasingly important in the past decades. And we have seen the Pope apologizing to the Jews, Belgium to the people of the Congo, the British Queen to the Maori, and so on and so forth, which can only be understood via the globalization of national political consciousness. Politicians, governments, and social agents act as if the whole world is watching us. The development of communication technology, of course, contribute to the globalization of communication and public apology. Sometimes people try to discover closure through a symbolic act such as an apology. The hope is that apology can provide a meaningful conclusion to a difficult chapter of history, but in reality, each generation might want to interpret differently as they related themselves to the past differently. And it is unfortunately oftentimes we are seeing beginning of new conflicts laid on to top of the heritage sites in the refusal to acknowledge and to feel the remorse. Thus, closure might be reopened if necessary. Recognition and interpretation are absent. In recent years in Australia, we are seeing the then Prime Minister Kevin Rudd apologize to the indigenous people in 2008. More recently in Taiwan, President Tsai Ing-wen apologized to the indigenous people soon after officially starting her service to the people. A more recent example can be found in North Carolina, where Davidson College issued a public apology for its ties to and complicity in slavery in the past August. It announced that the school is adopting a racial equity action plan that includes providing education of racism and slavery, ensuring living wages for campus workers, and reviewing the names of key spaces and buildings, including an iconic building named in honor of an early benefactor of the school who engaged in slave trading. In Taiwan, we are seeing trying to do the same with establishing the Transitional Justice Commission, TJC, which is also in charge of identifying difficult heritage as related to the unjust processes of capturing, imprisoning, sentencing, or killing of dissidents in the post-war years. In this slide, a former prison on the Green Island is listed as a national monument and reused as part of the National Museum of Human Rights. Earlier, we've already seen the Truth and Reconciliation Commission established in South Africa, and soon the maximum security prison on Robben Island was listed as World Heritage for its witnessing the history of people pursuing freedom and democracy under oppression. We might want to see the nomination as both a result of and a cause of reconciliation as processes. But ongoing conflicts and reconciliation yet to be made are also critical issues and prevailing everywhere, especially in cases in which indigenous people and their traditional territories are involved. The recent nomination of the Inca road system submitted by 5 nations was held up by committee members as a model of peaceful cooperation. while no mention was made of the long-standing indigenous protests in Argentina opposing the inscription. Earlier, the case of Kakadu National Park in Australia is also an important reference. Heritage matters were intersected by mining in the traditional territories of the indigenous people, whose participation was not ensured nor respected at the first place. William Logan, the speaker from 3 weeks ago, published an important paper about how the Jebiluka case highlights the importance of governance and political factors in understanding heritage protection as cultural resources. So when we talk about reconciliation and heritage, we have to pay attention to the scale of reconciliation that could include domestic trauma, bilateral conflicts, and regional reconciliation, and the fact that they are often intertwined across scales. We also need to pay attention to the broader context in which reconciliation is placed along with apology, compensation, repatriation. It is never a straight road. There is no one-for-all roadmap for us to get there. And in this slide, heritage can be seen as both a result of and a cause of reconciliation as processes. Apologists want to be forgiven, to restore institutional integrity, to find closure, and shed light on the way to move forward. It takes time for the following actions to materialize, and most importantly, for the wounds to heal. Sometimes the wounds would be reopened if the foundation laid by the former apology is removed. As we can see in the historical apology made by the then Prime Minister Tomiichi Murayama's talk in 1995, and how the effort has been seemingly redone under the Abe administration. In retrospect, that year of 1995 is quite remarkable, because it was also when the former President France, Jacques Chirac, acknowledged his country's responsibility for deporting tens of thousands of Jews to German death camps during World War II. While the Abe administration was seemingly moving away from the long road toward reconciliation with its neighboring countries, in 2018, France announced that it will rebuild a Holocaust museum and train station used in transport. It might be helpful to also look at how apology could be made in a more interactive way. In this case, Germany apologized for Hitler's invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1938, and the modern Czech Republic apologized for the expulsion of millions of German civilians living in the disputed Sudetenland. And following from there, the Czech Republic submitted the case of Fortress of Terezín as a heritage site in 2001. Unfortunately, it was seriously spotted in 2002, which is one of the reasons why it has remained on the tentative list of UNESCO World Heritage. In stimulating debate about history and its significance, acknowledgement of wrongdoing puts the issue on record formally and publicly, and on this note, reflecting the agency of historical apology and how it matters to world heritage. It is important to demand that those who are benefiting from World Heritage sites taking accountability to ensuring the learning from the past. And here I want to introduce a quote from the former Swedish Prime Minister Göran Persson. Quote, "The future we are shaping now is the past that we will share tomorrow." This is a quote from the former Prime Minister Persson, who plays an important role in bringing about the internationalization of the talk over how to remember the Holocaust. It is quite difficult to do that, and it takes time. In the case of the Holocaust heritage, it was actually done long after one of the most famous heritage sites, the Auschwitz concentration camp, was listed. It was until in 1998 in Stockholm, Prime Minister Persson invited the US President and the British Prime Minister to a meeting on the Holocaust, attended by diplomats and historians of the Holocaust who were engaged in the restitution process. And next year, the International Task Force on Holocaust Education, Remembrance, and Research was founded in Washington with further participation of Germany and Israel. It was the aim of the minister to transform his national memorial activities into a transnational policy. So together with all the prominent experts, diplomats, politicians, he created a governmental network of action to develop a program for Holocaust education in various countries and to root its lessons in the respective societies. And one may wonder if similar networking, similar conversation could take place in the region we are in. In the rest of the presentation, let me turn to some cases related to the legacy and difficult memories in relation to colonialism and conflicts before World War II in East Asia. First of all, the site of Japan's Meiji Industrial Revolution, which is listed in 2015. And here I'm showing you a table, again, presented in the pamphlet available at the 39th session of World Heritage Committee in Germany. Within these three industrial typology, the pamphlet introduced the 23 components parts in 11 cities within 8 areas. And a notable case of Hiroshima Island is located in the Nagasaki era. And one of the biggest issues about this nomination has to do with its periodization that ended in 1910. And thereof selectively remembering and excluded the part about colonization of Korea. When visitors arrive in Nagasaki, like I did last year, one would find herself enjoy overlooking the Nagasaki port and the beautiful landscape where the Glover House is located. Quote, construction illustrates a fusion of British colonial style with traditional Japanese structural craftsmanship and landscaping, end of quote. This is a quote from its official webpage. Yet the interpretation hardly mentioned the costs of industrial development and exploitation under colonialism and imperial expansion being a central part of the historical process across borders. Most people might not have enough time and luck to visit the Hiroshima Island on boat themselves. Even if they are there, it is still not easy to receive the multiple interpretations of the heritage sites. Following the nomination, researchers and observers have pointed out the issues along with the case-specific narration and periodization. So again, there's debates about how the case living out the years following 1910 and the issues of colonialism and forced labor. So therefore, the UNESCO World Heritage Committee took time debating, discussing, hoping to bring about changes. So it would be important to know how several publication of interpretation strategy or revision of guideline has made some important advice. For example, quote, interpretation should allow an understanding of the full history of each site. It would be, while the period relevant to outstanding universal value will be the primary focus, interpretation will also include important aspects of the history of each component part before and after the period related to outstanding value. And regarding the revision made to the operation guideline, it would be important to know how important it is for the following cases to invite state parties to engage in dialogue with all stakeholders as part of the national processes to include the site on the tentative list. And state parties are encouraged to refrain from including on their list that cases that may potentially raise issues before these issues are solved through a dialogue with concerned state parties. And here focuses on how interpretation should ensure a feeling and spirit of inclusiveness, and through the facilitation of the involvement of stakeholders and associated communities in the development and implementation of interpreted programs. Yet, even with all this discussion and advices, it's still unclear how the interpretation of this site can be more inclusive. And as we can see within the report that listed conservation issues represented to the World Heritage Committee in 2018 regarding the case of Hiroshima, mainly the discussion is about the maintenance of the seawall and related conservation technique, but not so much about the issue of interpretation. Interpretation must be difficult as memories are layered, and in the layering, memories are recreated and represented, which is partially embodied by these human event strata on display at the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum. Most visitors will visit the dome both across the river and in front of the building. Yet much fewer visitors will pay a visit to the memorial park, where you can find, at a corner, you can find a memorial for Korean victims in the, as you can see on the right. Like in many cases, the interpretation offered on site is often limited, mainly focusing on the visible physical aspects of the heritage rather than the invisible, difficult memories at the corner of the park. When I was there 3 years ago in Hiroshima, we could see exhibition about the historical visit of the former US President Barack Obama in 2016. And like this, we have seen much more attention given to notable politicians rather than remembering and interpretation from the bottom up. In order to encourage a more interactive interpretation based on cross-border conversation, it might be as important to highlight in this case visitors from the former colonies, such as Koreans and Taiwanese people's experiences and understanding of history, as the former US President's visit to Hiroshima. Otherwise, it would again reinforce the nation-state's power over dominating interpretation of heritage and preventing heritage from being more inclusively understood and communicated among people. Towards the end, I would like to talk about the final case of the Shen leprosarium in relation to similar cases in South Korea, Malaysia, and elsewhere. In Taiwan, we have this list of potential World Heritage sites to promote cross-border understanding of cultural heritage since 2002. Among the 18 sites listed, there are 2 sites of indigenous heritage, as you can see on the right. And in addition, the case of the Leshan leprosarium is worth some more discussion here. Leshan leprosarium was built in 1932 under the Japanese colonization. In the same period, under the same public health knowledge that focused on segregation, Japan also built leprosies in its interior lands and Korea. Cases were also present available in the British Strait settlement, the Philippines, Hawaii, etc. Leprosariums at that time were similar to an institution of total control, where the patient's freedom of movement and social participation were seriously deprived. But it was only until very recent this case and the suffering of the patient gradually became known, as the Xinjiang Metro line construction was going to demolish the leprosarium and rehouse the aging patients in a high-rise building. So unprecedented activism occurred, which brought attention to the case and eventually saved half of the leprosarium. Today, the preserved area is planned as a national cultural park of Hansen disease and medical human rights. But for the activists and those living there, the oppression has been ongoing. The construction of the depot and workshop for the metro line has again handicapped the patient's everyday life and postponed the preservation of the leprosarium. And the activism has extended beyond border in this regard. The self-help group actually has worked with the International Association of Integration, Dignity, and Economic Advancement, Taiwan chapter since 2007. And actually in 2010, the former secretary of the self-help group, Mr. Lee, was invited to Korea to participate in the initiating of Seoul Declaration. which brought attention to the well-being of the patients and to recognize and protect the heritage site related to the particular history of Hansen disease as much as possible. In the past decade, there have been efforts to bring together sites across borders for serial nomination of World Heritage, including cases from the Philippines, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, and Hawaii, Malaysia. Yet a variety of challenges have discouraged the preparation. Some countries have started to work on their own individual submissions, such as you can see here. The Korean Leprosy Archives in the Philippines was inscribed into the Memory of the War in 2018. And last year, the case of Sangay Below Leprosarium in Malaysia was added to the tentative list of World Heritage Sites. It is a pity, however, without cross-border collaboration continuing, there is less likely that the issue of colonialism, exclusion, and resistance would be emphasized, especially the spirits of cross-border activism, which is such a great pity. And even if it seems inevitable given the limited frame of narration set up by each nation state, here we are seeing the possibility and the limits of World Heritage as an internationalized, institutionalized framework of interpreting the past. So to close my presentation, I do believe that World Heritage sites, especially those of contested history, might offer possibilities for the visitors who go beyond locating the perpetrator or judging about crimes and culpability. It has the potential for the visitors in being there to understand how wrongful decisions were made and brought about disastrous consequences. In doing so, we might be able to learn from the past and avoid making the same mistake. However, communities suffering from the pain, shame, and anger might have courage and empathy towards one another and be more willing to take necessary actions to re-establish connections. Interpretation of heritage sites should play a role in guiding this journey, but it is the communities across borders who have to actively participate in making heritage sites meaningful for all. And I think the UNESCO World Heritage Program would have responsibility to facilitate and encourage this process. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Appreciate for your lecture. And would you stop screen sharing?